Episode 3 of Moon Knight was an interesting one because it was my least favorite episode of the series thus far. So let's talk through a little bit of it and talk about why that is. I did think it was fascinating because before, a lot of people were given an early screener of Moon Knight, and they in those screeners they were able to see the first 4 episodes. So we've seen now the first 3 episodes. I don't get any screeners, and a lot of people were saying that the show was about a 4 out of 5, 4 out of 5 stars. In fact, I saw that from several people, and I thought that was kind of interesting because a lot of people would have given the other Marvel series, 4 out of 5 or higher. And a lot of the Marvel series that existed thus far have been received really, really well. And so I kind of was thinking to myself, like, especially after I watched the first episode and I thought, well, this is a 5 out of 5 episode 1. I watched episode 2 and I thought, well, this is probably about, 4.5 out of 5 episode. It's a pretty good episode. Now I watch this episode and I go, okay, I get it. This is probably more like a 3 out of 5 episode. It's not the best episode. Honestly, what it felt like to me was it felt like a 50-minute episode that should have been 2 separate 40-minute episodes, because they did 3 or 4 big things during this particular episode. And by the way, I am going to spoil this. So just heads up, I'm going to be spoiling episode 3 of Moon Knight. We had the scene where all of the avatars of the Egyptian gods are meeting. Therefore, the Egyptian gods are all meeting in the pyramid of Giza. We had that scene, which was a big scene. Could have been the end. It could have been like a climactic scene reveal. We also had the scene where Khonshu and I believe it's actually Steven, if I'm remembering it correctly, but Khonshu and Steven turn the sky backwards so that it can see what the sky would have looked, what the night sky would have looked like 2,000 years prior. Those are 2 pretty big events happening in one episode, and it felt like those 2 things could have been separated up into 2 different episodes. But and that's why I think it suffered a little bit. But let's go ahead and get into it a little bit more, because there's some things that we learn in this episode that are pretty interesting. So the first thing we learn is that Layla deals with black market Egyptian goods. So we get a little bit more of information about her persona. We also know that her father was an archaeologist. Her father's basically Indiana Jones when it comes down to it. And I think we're going to learn more about him. And I think there's going to be a little bit more Indiana Jones quality to her father based on the hints that they're giving us in episode 3. And she's in this scene, she's forging a passport to Egypt. So if we had thought previously that Layla was sort of an innocent party in this whole thing, she's really not. She's not obeying the laws, so to speak. So that's an interesting side of Layla's character in Moon Knight that presents her with some more compelling reasons to tag along. She actually has a reason to be there. She actually has a lot of agency, and she's a much more interesting character now that we get that opening scene of Moon Knight episode 3, where I don't know if that lady is her mom. I don't think so, but her building the forged passport with that lady is kind of really, really fascinating. Never before has Marc Spector felt like Poe Dameron than in this episode of Moon Knight. He really feels like Poe Dameron. There's a moment in the knife fight where he goes, "What are we doing? We fighting? We dancing?" That was like a Poe Dameron line, and I kind of like that. I thought that was kind of cool. But this episode does showcase that there are now more personalities to Moon Knight than we had previously known. We have Stephen Grant, the mild-mannered, non-violent, amateur Egyptian scholar, and they portray him as a very subservient, very gentle British character. Then we have Marc Spector, a practical, let's get things done, action-driven guy, which is portrayed as an American personality, which I found really interesting. And then there's this ultra-violent third character who we technically have not met yet. I believe that character is in some of the comic versions of Moon Knight. So people who have read those and who have a background in that will probably know who that character is. But we, as viewers of the show who have not read the comics, don't know who that is yet. We just know that there's a character that is much more diabolical in his behavior, because Marc Spector is willing to do a lot of things, but we continually see Marc pull back from doing something that is truly heinous. So, for example, he's very willing to fight all three guys in the knife fight, but he's shocked when he kills one of them, and then he's extremely disappointed in Khonshu when the younger fighter, the boy fighter, I guess he looked a little older than a boy to me, but the younger guy cuts his own scarf and falls back off the cliff. Mark seems pretty terrified of that because he took Khonshu's advice and said, if you just hold him over the edge of the cliff, he'll talk. And of course he doesn't. And by the way, Khonshu doesn't seem like a very good guy, because Khonshu does not care that character died. Does not care at all. He just kind of says like, who cares? Big deal. So Khonshu continues to be a problem. We predicted that from episode 1 on this show. We said Khonshu is not a good guy, and it's going to continually be problematic, and that has been continually true. So we've been right on that front. Now, in the scene where we see all of the gods and avatars gathered, that presents us with some pretty interesting questions. The first question is, why can the gods not be present without the use of an avatar? We don't know that. I have not heard of that concept in Egyptian mythology. Now, I will say I'm not an Egyptian scholar of any kind, so maybe that is a concept that is frequently utilized. What we do see is that their avatars, this is the first time we've really seen this. Like, what we've seen in Moon Knight prior is that it felt like they could be indicating that there was some sort of possession. But then we also saw that, Mark was able, and even Steven were able to call on the suit. They called it summoning the suit, which he does several times. And it's a healing suit that can cause him to heal himself. I don't know how much Khonshu is controlling Mark or Steven when the suit is on them. I don't know what that means. But in this scene where the avatars go into the Temple of Giza, or the Pyramid of Giza, to have a discussion about Arthur Harrow and what Arthur Harrow is doing, this is where possession is readily apparent. The gods are speaking to one another through their avatars. In fact, Oscar Isaac is doing his best impersonation of Khonshu when Khonshu's speaking through him. They bring in Arthur Harrow. They have a conversation about what's going on. That was probably, from a possession standpoint, probably the creepiest portion of the show that we've seen thus far, because the idea is, is there such a thing as possession, spiritual possession of some kind? This show is suggesting that there is, and that the Egyptian gods can do that. I don't think that we've seen that in the Marvel Cinematic Universe prior to this. We've seen some, people with, let's say, mental illness who do some things they don't want to do. We've seen some very human things, like Bruce Banner, who has temper tantrums and turns into the Hulk. So those are very human-like metaphors. This is the first time that we're actually seeing possession of a earthly being by a spiritual being, and that is pretty interesting to see in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And it's a really good, deep discussion that we could get into, because how do we think of possession today? I mean, there's multiple ways to look at it. Everything from, there are people who talk about possession being like demonic possession. You see a lot of movies about demonic possession where there is a spiritual entity that does not have good things in store for the person, and they're possessing the person and having them do, horrific things. That is a really interesting take on, that's a general Western take on spiritual possession. If you were just to watch movies, is that the demonic entities exist to take over a human body and then do a bunch of bad things. And that seems like an interesting interpretation, quite frankly, a strange interpretation of what you might say the Bible deals with when it deals with spiritual possession. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some elements of the Bible's spiritual possession that are similar in nature, but I haven't studied what Islam would say about spiritual possession, so that would be an interesting thing to hear from if you are of an Islamic faith or know about Islamic faith. If you could let us know what spiritual possession looks like from that perspective, if there is such a thing. But a lot of times from a biblical perspective, spiritual possession is more along the lines of it causes physical ailments, it causes maybe mental ailments, but you always have to ask yourself a question of like, well, what is the goal of the person who's of the possessor of the demon in this case, right? And that's always an interesting question to ask. And I don't know that there's a good answer, and I don't know that we're always given a good answer. But I think what you'd have to say from a Judeo-Christian standpoint is that it's not like the devil or demons have a purpose to make humans miserable. That doesn't make a lot of sense. In fact, making humans extremely comfortable in a way where they would not think about God seems like a more effective tactic than just making their lives miserable. And if there's some reason they're trying to possess people so that they can get some level of worship or some level of interaction or something, again, making people's lives completely miserable um, seems like an odd technique. Now, if you said to me, spiritual entities try to work through addiction, try to work toward through temptations to and those things will drive you away from God, then that would make a lot more sense to me. In this case, what we're seeing in Moon Knight is that the possession is still a little bit convoluted because we know that the only people we've seen possessed are the avatars of the gods who are not um, you know, exiled, right? Because Arthur Harrow is not possessed by Amit. He's just working on her behalf. But the gods that are possessing the people are seemingly trying to keep the peace and not disrupt too many things. And that's one of the reasons why they're upset with Khonshu, is because he's sort of upsetting the balance. He's already caused a massive eclipse, which means that there's more attention that's drawn to the Egyptian gods. And there seems to be an indication that they don't want that attention, which is pretty interesting. So they're trying to do whatever they can, but they may not be influencing the world, like they used to in ancient Egypt. So all of those things are fascinating, and we'll see what comes about later in this series about what happens there. Getting into the scenes after that, we see Layla and Mark visit the black market dealer. I did not love that sequence either. That also felt like a really rushed sequence to me. There were moments of that sequence that felt like they were trying to up the tension a little bit more, but that just didn't seem. It just seemed rushed. It felt like there's probably a scene that's twice as long on the cutting room floor that would have been even more compelling in those kind of contexts. Like, for example, the pacing is such that when they show up, there's a lot of time spent showcasing that there's the shirtless guy on a horse with playing with spears, and it's kind of like, okay, you spend quite a bit of time on that, wherein the tension leading up to the big fight after they look in the sarcophagus actually felt a little bit rushed to me. And it felt like they could have drawn that tension out, drawn that suspension out a little bit longer. So again, if this episode had been 2 episodes instead, I think that would have been a lot better. But 50 minutes is a long episode for a Marvel series. Both Marvel and Star Wars have kept their series episodes usually to about 35 to 45 minutes. So an extra 5 minutes on top of that's long, and it felt like it was almost leading up to 2 separate episodes. And maybe they thought, well, this isn't moving fast enough, so we've got to put those 2 episodes together. And they did that in the editing room. I don't know, but I would not be surprised if that were true. There are some implications here that I think are going to be really interesting to the character of Marc Spector, because the implication in this show is that Mark had something to do with Layla's dad's death. Now, my assumption or my prediction, I could be totally wrong about this, but I'm starting to wonder if Khonshu isn't the one who, I think Mark was probably working with Layla's dad. They found some Egyptian artifacts. They may even have unleashed Khonshu from some sort of sarcophagus or unleashed his presence. And I'm thinking that what happened is Khonshu did something that almost killed both of them. And then Mark said, okay, well, then I'll take on the role of Moon Knight if you save me. So either Layla's dad was accessing the powers of Khonshu, or they discovered Khonshu together. Either way, by Mark choosing to take on the Moon Knight role, he saved himself, but was not able to save her father. Something along those lines is, I feel like, maybe what happened to Layla's father. And Mark doesn't want to talk about that because he carries a lot of guilt in being the one that saved himself by agreeing to what Khonshu wanted. We also know that there is some relation because Khonshu has already told Mark that he would have Layla be his avatar next, and Mark doesn't want that to happen. So there's some connectivity there that we don't fully know, but I think it's related to something along those lines. Then we get the basically the end scene, if you will, where Khonshu is turned to stone. They're turning the sky back so they can find Amit's resting place, which they get from the sarcophagus in Egypt. And that's when the Ennead says, you know what, Khonshu, you're doing too much. You're disrupting the balance of everything. I mean, he's doing things at this point that are going to get the attention of S.H.I.E.L.D., then to get the attention of the Avengers. Like, you can't just turn the sky backwards and not expect S.H.I.E.L.D. to be like, what in the world is going on here, right? So he's doing things that are going to draw attention to Egypt and the Egyptian gods, and the Egyptian gods do not like that very much. What's really fascinating to me here is that episode 4 of Moon Knight, Moon Knight, the armor is not going to be available because Khonshu is not available. Khonshu is removed from this whole scene. So that is going to be a really fascinating aspect of this show that we'll have to see more about as we go into episode 4. And then I think we have 6 episode series total. So we're halfway through, and right now Moon Knight is off the table. So we'll have to see how that works. And we'll also have to see, with Moon Knight being off the table, what happens with Mark's personalities. Do these personalities still shift in and out, or is that something that is kind of dictated by Moon Knight, by Khonshu? I'm not really sure. So there you go. There's the breakdown of episode 3.